Right. Hello, everyone. My name is Chang Dan, and I'm a postgraduate researcher and a lecturer at Nottingham Trent University. Welcome to the second day of the Building Bridges Conference, which is curated by researchers at Nottingham Trent University's Postcolonial Studies Centre in collaboration with the Boddington Gallery. The conference features discussions and deconstructions of long-held dominant ideologies and narratives that function to sustain the invisibility of colonial and imperial legacies in the contemporary world. Today's discussion will start with our keynote speakers, Dr. Sophie Chao, who will be speaking about how transdisciplinary, experimental, and decolonial imaginaries can help us better understand and address environmental destruction and social injustice in an epoch of global climate change. I'll introduce her to you formally in a moment. We'll also have two following panels today. The first focuses on the themes of resistance, representation, and marginalized communities, and the second on the themes of environmentalism, conservation, and decolonization. I hope you can join us for these two panels as well. So let's kick off with the second keynote speech. So first of all, I just want to say a huge thank you to Sophie for agreeing to join us today. It's such an honor to have you here and to learn more about your work. Dr. Sophie Chao is an environmental anthropologist and multi-species ethnographer. Her research investigates the intersections of capitalism, ecology, indigeneity, health, and justice in the Pacific, and her theoretical thinking inspired by interdisciplinary fields, including the environmental humanities and science and technology studies, as well as indigenous, postcolonial, and critical race studies, which aligns very much with the themes of our conference. Sophie is currently a Discovery Early Career Research Award Fellow and lecturer in anthropology at the University of Sydney. She's also secretary on the Executive Committee of the Australian Anthropological Society and co-convener of the Australian Food Society and Culture Network. Sophie previously worked for the International Indigenous Rights Organisation Forest Peoples Programme in the United Kingdom and Indonesia. Her current project explores the diverse perceptions, practices, and knowledges surrounding human-kangaroo relations in Australia. Her forthcoming book, In the Shadow of the Palms, More Than Human Becoming in West Papua, which will come out in June 2022, draws on long-term ethnographic fieldwork and prior human rights advocacy in the Indonesian-controlled region of West Papua, and explore how deforestation and monocrop oil palm expansion affects the multi-species life world of the indigenous marine communities. I can't wait to get my hands on this book. Sophie has also published a number of essays, book chapters, and articles, and appeared in numerous podcasts discussing multi-species kinships and issues of plantation, capitalism, and related socio-ecological injustices. So you can check out her work on her website, www.morethanhumanworlds.com. Sophie's talk today is titled Decolonising the Fields, Insights from the Pacific in an Age of Planetary Unravelling. She will be reviewing her paper for roughly 40 minutes, after which there will be a Q&A session. So please do submit your questions via the YouTube live chat or email them to us at buildingbridges@ntu.ac.uk. Okay, so the floor is yours, Sophie, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much for that wonderful introduction. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening to all of you who are listening in to this keynote. I'm speaking to you this evening from the lands of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation here in Australia. And I'd like to start my talk by acknowledging Gadigal elders, past, present, and emergent, and also pay tribute to Gadigal kin, both human, animal, vegetal, and elemental. The lands of the Gadigal, like those of Indigenous peoples the world over, were taken from them without consent, treaty, or compensation. They are lands whose stories have historically been silenced, stolen, and sanitized, and they are also lands of ongoing Indigenous survivance, continuance, and resurgence. Many thanks to the organizers of Building Bridges for inviting me to deliver a keynote at this conference, a conference that I see as responding directly to the growing and urgent call for decolonial, anti-colonial, and post-colonial modes of scholarly knowledge production within and across disciplines. I'm both honored and humbled by this invitation, and I really appreciate the opportunity to share with you some of my own situated experiences working in the decolonial space and working towards unsettling dominant ideologies that obscure the violent lives and afterlives of colonial regimes in the contemporary world. So before I start my talk, let me clarify where I'm coming to this keynote from in terms of my own positionality. I'm speaking to you as a Eurasian female scholar who lives in Australia. an arguably post-colonial state where Indigenous peoples continue to be subjected to the racializing and dispossessory violence of internal settler colonial rule. I'm speaking to you also as an environmental anthropologist who conducts ethnographic fieldwork among Indigenous peoples in West Papua, a region that has been colonized by Indonesia for now over 60 years, and whose peoples also continue to be denied the right to sovereignty and self-determination. My research across these two geographies has focused to date on the intersections of ecology, capitalism, indigeneity, health, and justice, all within a broader era of planetary unravelling that has come to be known among some as the Anthropocene. And I've been particularly interested in the complex ways in which Indigenous peoples themselves experience, theorize, and contest the adverse impacts of mass deforestation and monocrop oil palm expansion on their relationships both to one another and to the diverse other than human beings who animate their more than human life worlds, both past, present, and emergent. The themes that my scholarship explores, the environment, the climate, the Anthropocene, together with the places that I examine these themes in and from, have made an engagement with decolonialism both necessary, challenging, and generative. In both West Papua, my ethnographic field site, and in Australia, my institutional home, the question of decolonization cannot be dissociated from the broader historical and political context of Indigenous sovereignties denied and deferred, and also from extractive modes of scholarship, wherein academic careers continue to be built on the cultures of others, or what Māori scholar Margaret Stewart Harawira calls knowledge capitalism. Decolonization in these world regions, as indeed elsewhere, is at once structural, epistemic, ethical, and methodological in its contents, contours, and complexities. Over the last decade, I have sought to grapple with the possibility of a decolonial anthropology beyond this expression's potentially paradoxical or even oxymoronic valences. Central to this endeavour, I have learned, is a nuanced attention to the force of dominant epistemologies and institutions, to the frictions and incommensurabilities arising between different ways of knowing and being, and to what is and can be done to challenge hegemonic knowledge regimes, both across fields and across field sites. Acknowledging positionality, as I'm sure all of you are well attuned to, is key to conversations around decolonialism. As I noted, I'm writing, teaching, and speaking as a middle-class Eurasian woman, striving to reconcile Anglo-European forms of research and interpretation with Indigenous epistemologies, operating across two geographic terrains where settler colonial rule is very much alive and well, and also within a discipline, anthropology, that has historically reproduced or been used to reproduce the disciplining and extractive violence of settler colonization. To document and to critique colonization and its effects, as my scholarship attempts to do, is important. But of course, it is not in and of itself tantamount to the decolonization of actual places, actual peoples, actual lands, and actual territories, as Eve Tuck, Zoe Todd, and many other Indigenous scholars remind us. What I've tried to do over the course of the last decade is to craft collaborative strategies towards a decolonial anthropology, in close conversation with Indigenous communities and Indigenous scholars. And it is some of these strategies that I want to share with you today, with the caveat, of course, that they are anything but exclusive or exhaustive, and rather always in the making, transforming, and emerging in the course of the kinds of conversations that this conference, amongst others, are trying to forge. So I thought long and hard about how to approach this keynote. I thought of offering you a reflection on the colonial architectures of the university system and its power asymmetries and erasures. I thought of offering you practical advice on how to design research in a decolonial mode, from the ethics of fieldwork to the question of citational politics, engaged outputs, and activist research. There is so much to be said on these matters, which I'll touch on indirectly in my talk, and which I'm more than happy to discuss in the Q&A. But in the spirit of collaborative knowledge production, or building bridges in the language of this conference, I'm going to focus on drawing out some key insights and invitations developed through shared research with one of my close Indigenous collaborators, with whom I've been trying to think across disciplines and towards decolonial environmental imaginaries in this age of planetary unmaking. My colleague Dion Enari, whose permission I've sought to share our research today, is a lecturer at the Auckland University of Technology in Aotearoa, New Zealand. Dion holds the Ali'i Lefaoali'i, or High Talking Chief title, Lefaoali'i, from Lepa, Samoa. And Dion's research is centrally concerned with Indigenous knowledge-making practices, empowerment, and well-being. You can read an interview I did with Dion at the link on the slide here, which you can access through my website, morethanhumanworlds.com. So Dion and I have engaged with the climate crisis through distinct yet intersecting personal and intellectual trajectories. For me, the visceral violence of environmental destruction surfaced through my long-term fieldwork in rural West Papua, where deforestation and oil palm plantation developments are radically rupturing the intimate and ancestral kinships of Indigenous marin communities to their other-than-human kin, from plants and animals to soils, waters, ecosystems, and more. For Dion, the effects of climate change are an existential threat, as Samoa, his home island, is disproportionately vulnerable to rising sea levels. It was these trajectories that brought us to try to cross-pollinate our situated knowledges and positionalities as specific scholars and climate dwellers, and develop a toolkit or manifesto of sorts for interdisciplinary, experimental, and decolonial imaginaries in this age of ecological crisis. And what I'm going to do is take you through some of these aspects as developed in our manifesto, including principles of relationality, beyond humanness, storytelling, multisensoriality, reflexivity, transdisciplinarity, and more. But before we jump into these grammars of the imagination, why focus on imaginaries in decolonizing knowledge and knowledge production in this age of planetary unmaking? Well, because in many ways, the imagination and the climate crisis are profoundly entangled. Climate change, according to Indian novelist Amitav Ghosh, is nothing less than, quote, a crisis of culture and thus of imagination, end quote. The journalist David Wallace Wells has comparably described climate change as the tragic result of, quote, an incredible failure of imagination, end quote. In taking the imagination as our central object of inquiry, Dion and I aimed to push against the paralyzing politics of despair that can so easily arise in the face of the climate crisis as an omnipresent and seemingly insurmountable hyper-object. In our view, it is not the failure of imagination itself that is the issue. Rather, the problem lies in the exclusionary scope of voices and beings represented by current dominant climate imaginaries. Imaginaries that remain firmly anchored in the logic of human mastery over a nature recast as a passive material substrate, meaningful only to the extent that it is useful to certain humans. The voices obscured by dominant imaginaries and their scholarly representation include those of Indigenous peoples and other non-Western societies across the tropics and beyond, who have always recognized the interdependencies of human and other than human beings, yet who tend to bear the brunt of environmental crisis in their everyday lives. They include also marginalized voices within marginalized communities, those of women, of children, of the non-human, and of the elemental, both present, past, and yet to come. These violent epistemic exclusions, as Maori scholar Christine Winter has argued, call for more inclusive imaginaries that are accountable to the situated and connected worlds that we inherit and that we transmit across time, generation, and species. They demand that we cease failing those whose imaginations are occluded from epistemic and moral purview. They prompt us to consider also what ancestors we will become and how we will be remembered by imagined communities of life to come. Imaginaries, then, I think, are good to think with in a decolonial vein because they conjure the varied, uneven, and complex ways in which realities are conceptualized, fashioned, and represented. Imaginaries are shaped by divergent sociocultural contexts, colonial pasts and afterlives, material ecological terrains, and ideological and physical infrastructures that link the local to the global through partial connections. As a battlefield, to borrow the terms of critical race scholar Ruha Benjamin, imaginaries can expand possibilities of life in challenging the hegemony of entrenched power asymmetries and their actors and institutions. To imagine means experimenting with uncertainty, risk, and ambiguity. It paves the way for birthing unexpected and powerful modes of hope and resistance that can help to counter prevailing representations of inevitable social and ecological decline and disappearance. To imagine can also become a call to radical decolonial action driven by ethical, material, and political prerogatives. Recast as such, then, the imagination can become a practice of sovereignty and self-determination, one that invites imaginative solidarities across place, time, and beings, and that can offer for us as scholars a tentative path for writing and worlding worlds more critically, collectively, creatively, and capaciously. So let me begin with relationality as a decolonial mode of being and imagining. Pacific Island ontologies, such as those lived and passed on by Dion and his kin in island Samoa and by indigenous peoples in the rainforests of West Papua, are premised upon a holistic and relational union between humans, the environment, and the afterlife. Each actant within this sentient ecology plays a consequential role in shaping the worlds of others, from subterranean microbes and fungi to oxygen-producing trees, ground-churning mammals, pollinating birds and insects, and protective or guardian spirits and energies. There are no individual or autonomous actors within this more than human world. Rather, as Tongan scholar Epeli Hauofa and Torres Strait Islander Kerry Arabena remind us, there are only multiple, interactive companionships bound in a relational ethic of kinship and care. This relationality speaks to the vital importance of reciprocity in sustaining more than human conditions of livability. It also invites us to rethink the imagination itself as a relation, one that draws on but also vastly transcends human-centric priorities, perceptions, and possibilities. To imagine and story the climate crisis relationally helps to reframe individual everyday acts through their spatially, temporally distributed impacts upon other planetary dwellers. We become aware of the multiple actors and forces that shape this climate crisis, from communities, states, and corporations to activists, researchers, markets, technologies, ideologies, and many more. At some junctures, situated environmental imaginaries may fall into alignment, offering avenues for alliance and cosmopolitical action. At other junctures, imaginaries come into friction, highlighting incompatibilities across different interests, values, and norms. In each instance, we as scholars might ask, which lives and ecologies are at stake, sacrificed, or prioritized by our imaginaries and our representations? What do these imaginations do in and for the world? What place is there for my imaginary in yours, and yours in mine? In this unevenly connected and ongoingly threatened world, what constitutes our common ground? Reframing intellectual and political imaginations as relational, in turn, invites a decolonization of the imagination beyond the human. By this, Dion and I mean an imagination that takes seriously the possibility of other than human beings as both objects of harm and as subjects of injustice. Indeed, as Aboriginal Australian scholar Jacqueline Troy notes, the ravaging effects of climate change on planetary ecosystems makes it abundantly clear that it is not only humans who can suffer from violence and disregard. The scale of devastation to animals, plants, and ecosystems foregrounds the need for conceptions of well-being, care, and dignity that consider the interests of all Earth beings, to borrow Marisol de la Cadena's terms. Earth beings not as autonomous, individuated wholes, but rather as parts and as partners in processual, more than human becomings. At the same time, a beyond human imagination challenges us to expand what we mean by beyond human to include not just other life forms or bios, but also elements such as ecosystems, such as oceans, rivers, mountains, and soils that many indigenous peoples consider to be equally animate and sentient. It invites us to ask as scholars, how do we learn to listen to the beyond human world? Who can speak with and for this beyond human world? And what should we do with the stories entrusted to us by the beyond human world? To take these questions seriously is critical in eschewing human exceptionalism and its devastating impacts on our environments. It demands instead a cultivation of intellectual and ethical openness to the possibility of other than human sentience, will, and desire, together with the repositioning of the human as one within a much broader spectrum of matter and meaning across both deep and present time. In this sense, then, beyond human imaginaries invite a practice of humility, a recognition that other beings too have rich and meaningful life worlds, even if we can never fully access or understand them. This is not a humility that belittles the human, nor is it one that excludes the human from the natural, nor indeed that is premised on a dichotomy between the human and the non-human. Rather, this is an inclusive mode of humility that can enlarge our conceptual and imaginative horizons by accommodating others in all their myriad animal, vegetal, and elemental manifestations. Stories offer another potent medium for reimagining the climate relationally and beyond the human. Let me give you an example. In West Papua, where I've been conducting research amongst Indigenous marine peoples, species, human or other, do not exist as categories, but rather as stories, or chirita in local terms. The life ways of these beings are irreducible to fixed or bounded taxonomies. Rather, organisms come into being through richly complex and orally transmitted stories or narratives that flesh out their origins, movements, subsistence, and social and emotive lives. Individual plants and animals have stories, as do plant and animal collectives, ecosystems, and even entire territories. Stories multiply as one travels across the living landscape, intersecting with one another in a dense meshwork of intertwined experiences, events, and memories. The cassowary story becomes the river, that becomes the canopy, that becomes the tree kangaroo, that becomes the child, that becomes the sago palm, that becomes the storyteller. Together, humans and other than humans partake in one ongoing and constantly transforming multi-species story. Stories matter in reimagining and decolonizing earthly ecologies because they too participate in the world that they describe. As the multi-species ethnographer Tom Van Doren notes, quote, fleshier, livelier stories can make us care more, end quote. As such then, stories are not just cultural artifacts, they are also political tools that can compel readers and auditors to situate the world and themselves within it otherwise. Stories can move, inspire, sadden, shock, or enlighten us. As a decolonial research methodology, in the terms of Sto'olo Nation member Joanne Archibald, storying speaks to narratives and experiences that are collectively produced and passed on across generations as intangible heritage about tangible worlds. As Solomon Islander and political theorist Tarcisius Kabutaulaka puts it, quote, stories frame beliefs, understandings and relationships with each other and the world around us. Our lives are interwoven stories. We live in an ocean of stories, end quote. Stories then are not make-believe in the sense of fictional fantasies, disconnected from the worlds they describe, but stories can make us believe in and achieve better shared worlds. As such, they are powerful instruments for collective anti-colonial action amidst rampant environmental destruction and its rippling effects, both within and across species lines. The story beyond human worlds involves engaging sensorially with the environment in crisis through a kind of slowing down of thought and movement, a kind of slowing down that unfortunately is not something that neoliberal university regimes encourage. This slowing down is captured beautifully in a proverb that was often shared with me by my Indigenous Marin companions in West Papua. As they would put it, stop talking, start listening, stop writing, start walking, end quote. What my Marin companions are calling for here is a silencing of the self that makes space for the voices of others, the ripple of a river, the shy whistle of a bird, or the gentle sway of a sago palm frond. Rather than adopting a distant, disembodied, and omniscient perspective on the world, the kind of multisensory, immersive imagination that Marin invite us to embody takes as its starting point the literal grounds in and upon which planetary life arises, transforms, senses, and senesces. This is also a move away from framing the imagination as purely conceptual or ideological, something conjured only by human minds and detached from our always more than human surroundings. Instead, a multisensory imagination calls for a phenomenological immersion in the material world that we are part of and that we study, its textures, smells, sounds, sights, and movements. This is a move away from the abstract and theoretical and deep into the wet, sticky, messy textures of multi-species worlds. A move in anthropologist Anna Singh's terms away from looking ahead and instead to looking around. This invitation then is one to imagine and to think not just with our minds and thoughts and eyes, but also with our feet, our hands, our sweat, our breath, to attend to the violent histories of settler colonial capitalism that are inscribed literally upon landscapes, in their nomenclatures, in their infrastructures, in their ecosystems. As an emplaced practice, sensory imaginaries can also reveal how the conjoined logic of racialization, dispossession, and displacement continue to shape lives, deaths, and afterlives across and beyond the tropics. It foregrounds the slow and spectacular violence wrought by anthropogenic transformations in the shadow places of industrial capitalism, the monocrop oil palm plantations, the abyssal gold and copper mines, the acidified oceans, the depleted forests, and the eroded soils. Erasures and absences also matter to an emplaced imagination. They make us ask, who has been uprooted and transplanted to make today's world possible? What are the centers and peripheries of today's landscapes, and to whom are they hospitable or inhospitable? How do these places nourish us, and how do we in turn nourish them? Importantly, imagining the climate with others and otherwise demands that we reflect seriously on our own positionality as scholars, as practitioners, and as planetary dwellers. Such a reflexive imagination draws attention to the multiple power fields within which research takes place. This includes the power dynamics at play within the often heterogeneous community that we learn from, the power dynamics at play between researchers and their interlocutors, together with the institutions, values, and status that they represent, and also the power dynamics at play between knowledge systems across different local, disciplinary, and institutional settings. Each of these facets shapes the way in which knowledge is produced, shared, received, and acted upon. In this light, then, reflexive research is at once a political, ethical, and methodological practice. It demands that we continually and critically reflect not just on the questions we ask about the environment and its communities of life, but also, as Pacific scholar Una Isina Bobaba reminds us, how and with whom we formulate and answer these questions. One potent space to decolonize the way we think about our positionality is by rethinking the relationship between ethnography and theory. And here I'm speaking as an anthropologist. All too often, theory is something that is produced in, by, and for the global north, based on realities that supposedly just happen in the global south. In the process, Indigenous peoples' own theories and philosophies of environment and environmental crisis become colonized by Western paradigms, concepts, and idioms. As Banaban and African-American scholar Katarina Te Aiwa notes, the incorporation of Indigenous ways of knowing and being into dominant Western epistemic frames is far from a new practice. It perpetuates what Makere Stewart Harawira, whom I previously cited, calls knowledge capitalism, or the instrumentalization of Indigenous epistemologies in the interest of institutional ends that do not always account for, let alone serve, the interests of Indigenous peoples themselves. So to imagine climate change reflexively and in a decolonial mode invites an imperative shift away from the positioning of Indigenous peoples as research subjects and instead as joint producers of knowledge. As David Gageo and Alice Tapunga Somerville remind us, this includes bringing into the conversation not just the communities in the fields whom we work with, but also Indigenous scholars and scholarship that tend to be obscured by dominant Western canons and associated intellectual genealogies. Decolonizing our texts and theories is imperative in challenging the white and Western monopoly over knowledge and the imagination, and in doing justice to Indigenous intellectual agency. Importantly, this approach does not mean completely rejecting all non-Indigenous theory. As Māori scholar Tuhiwai Smith explains, to decolonize research means engaging with Western theory whilst also putting Indigenous peoples' concerns at the centre and approaching research, quote, from Indigenous peoples' perspectives and for Indigenous peoples' purposes, quote, end quote. When we conduct our research, then, we might perhaps ask ourselves, whose voices and knowledges are we drawing from? How is this represented in our citations and acknowledgements? Whose voices are missing from the conversation and why? What makes us decide to cite one scholar over another? What meanings and categories grow organically out of the research and which ones are imposed? What impression of ownership over concepts and ideas is created in the process? What is this knowledge for? Who is it in conversation with? And whom does it serve? The climate crisis is a multifaceted problem, and therefore it demands multidisciplinary responses. As multidisciplinary scholars ourselves, Dion and I engage with insights, methods, and theories derived from a wide array of fields: anthropology, plant science, history, education, and Indigenous studies, among others. Dion and I believe that this climate demands a kind of transdisciplinary practice that is at once synthetic and transformative, not just additive or complementary. What do we mean by this? Well, by transdisciplinary, we are calling for an engagement with other fields that invites us to seriously and critically rethink the premises and assumptions underlying the diverse ways in which we approach, understand, and act upon the world. Such transdisciplinary praxis in turn invites us to reconsider the questions that we think matter, why we think they matter, in whose interests, and with what intended or contingent effects. This is a difficult but necessary labor of translating our ideas and knowledges beyond familiar audiences to make them intelligible, accessible, and relatable across broader publics. This is also an approach that makes us reflect on what counts as knowledge in the first place, how different knowledges and knowledge production systems sit within prevailing hierarchies of worth, legitimacy, and value, and what can be done to destabilize the assumed power and validity of some knowledge regimes over others. In the context of climate change specifically, transdisciplinarity can help to push against the assumed supremacy of secular science over other ways of knowing. This is not to say that secular scientific and other epistemologies are incompatible, nor that secular science cannot lend itself to local interpretation, nor that Indigenous epistemologies are static or unchanging, nor that there is no such thing as Indigenous science. What we're calling out here is the fact that Indigenous and other non-Western epistemologies continue to be rendered secondary to secular science when they are classified as traditional ecological knowledge or as Indigenous wisdom. These labels often unwittingly conjure, again, the primacy of secular scientific regimes, even as groundbreaking scientific discoveries often reveal in other idioms what Indigenous sciences have always known, that plants communicate with each other, that carefully controlled fires nourish the soil, that killing environments eventually kills people. A transdisciplinary imagination, then, demands that we decolonize knowledge itself from bounded and hierarchized disciplines, both literal and figurative. Discipline, after all, lies at the heart of the imperial capitalist logic and its extractive ethos. Discipline within this logic positions the human as master and the non-human as resource. Discipline, in many ways, as a form of control, negates possibilities for freedom, experimentation, and creativity. The climate crisis itself, if anything, exemplifies the deadly endpoint of discipline, real or illusory, over the natural world. In doing so, then, the climate crisis itself invites a kind of emancipation of knowledge from the disciplinary strictures that determine where knowledge belongs and whether or by who it is valued. Let me now turn to radical imaginaries as an element of decolonial practice. In Dion's home of Samoa and in neighboring Pacific islands, Indigenous peoples' livelihoods, food and water security, and economies are being jeopardized by growingly unpredictable climate conditions. Climate refugeeism, along with rural impoverishment, are on the rise. Human displacement and dispossession are compounded by the obliteration of locally meaningful stories, cultures, and relations with the beyond human world, that in turn erode specific ways of being, becoming, and belonging. These are radical times that call for radical imaginations. In using the term radical, we find inspiration in the work of Native Studies and STS scholars Hi'ile Hobart and Tamara Nees, who call for radical care in a time of unprecedented social and environmental loss. Radical care, Hobart and Maroney and Nees write, provides glimmers of hope amidst precarious worlds, even as it remains embedded within systemic inequalities and hegemonic power structures. As a form of strategic audacity, radical care is, quote, a refusal not to care, and an imagining of an otherwise despite dark histories and potentially darker futures, end quote. In the context of climate imaginaries, then, a radical imagination can help to counter the crippling force of political apathy and the sense of helplessness/hopelessness that can accompany the seemingly unfathomable scales of loss and destruction that surround and haunt us. To imagine radically is to refuse not to imagine better futures. It is to insist on acting and interacting with the natural world in ways that can enable these futures to materialize. A radical imagination as a form of decolonial practice also invites attention to the challenge of navigating in our stories and narratives between experiences of loss and disempowerment and stories of resilience and resistance. In doing so, a radical imagination can help to subvert what Native American Anangut scholar Eve Tuck calls damage-centered approaches, or approaches that elide Indigenous forms of survivance by focusing solely or primarily on violence and endings. Instead, we need to tell together the story of climate change through acts of struggle, solidarity, and self-determination, the fighting and not just the sinking, in Dion's words. These modes of resistance can take multiple forms, from organized and global activism to sustained cultural and social practices, to the resilience of local foodways, to intergenerational knowledge transmission, and many more. As emergent and collective expressions of cultural and political creativity, these acts are just as central to the story of climate change as the climate crisis itself. To conclude then, the set of practices and principles that I've shared with you today may in some ways pave tentative pathways for more expansive, relational, and inclusive climate imaginaries. These practices and principles aim to counter the individualism and hierarchism of dominant colonial climate imaginaries that are no longer, indeed never have been, fit for purpose. They grow out of ongoing collaborations and conversations with Indigenous, Pacifica, and Papuan communities who are most deeply and directly mired in the fraught predicament of the climate crisis. They invite imaginative solidarities across places and times that, in the image of the climate itself, can serve to unite rather than divide us. These are practices and principles that call for a rethinking of our relation to the more than human world, one that includes and recognizes Indigenous Pacific cosmologies in which being human is always becoming with more than human others. But decolonizing climate imaginaries also demands a radical shift in the order of matter and thought, a radical change in direction and action, and this is no small task. As the Fijian historian Tracy Banivanua-Mar notes, decolonization in the Pacific is not a historic event, but rather a fragile, contingent, and ongoing process that continues well into the post-colonial era. Climate imaginaries, too, are profoundly shaped by violent histories of racial imperialism and their residual afterlives. As Potawatomi scholar Kyle Powys-White reminds us, the climate crisis for Indigenous peoples is less a new phenomenon than a colonial déjà vu, a perpetuation of long-standing processes of dispossession, displacement, and disempowerment. To unearth decolonial futures in and beyond academia is a learning process, one that I have found happens best in conversation with others, with students, with colleagues in anthropology and cognate fields, with Indigenous scholars and conspirers like Dion, and with the Indigenous communities whom I've had the immense privilege to think with and learn from in Papua and Australia. I think it's critical to keep critically interrogating what decolonization means, to whom, how the term's deployed, and what it takes to put it into practice. This raises difficult but necessary questions related to the political stakes of activist research, how we might situate contemporary worlds in dialogue with the past and the possible, how we might reckon with the responsibilities of academia in real life, intellectual and representational terms, and how we might participate in enacting the kinds of structural changes required to truly decolonize knowledge, its institutions, and its literal and figurative grounds of production. All of these concerns to me are linked to a bigger question of paramount importance, namely, what is social science knowledge for? Who gets to participate in its production, and who does this knowledge serve? Again, there are no easy answers to these questions, but what I do know is that they cannot be answered alone or through disciplinary silos. Instead, they invite conversation, debate, reflection through practices of respect and responsibility. And so with that, let's open the space for that dialogue to happen right now and among us. Thank you. Terima kasih. Alofa atu.
Thank you so much, Sophie. It's just so beautiful, and there's so many sort of like, points to think about and to digest really, and have many questions. But there are some questions from the audience, and I think I'll ask them first, and then move on to my own questions. So we have a question from Beth. So she says, my research in Black British literature, meaning that I have only really approached decoloniality in the context of the West, the metropole, and I'm therefore less familiar with the context of indigeneity. I have therefore not really come across the notion that decolonization should not be approached as a metaphor. Could you please talk a little bit more about this? Do you think there's a way for me to approach decolonization in the centre a scope which does not necessarily deal directly with indigenous and colonized land and peoples in the same way that's not leaning towards metaphorical?
Thank you very much for getting us started with that question, Beth. I think, so certainly, given that I do work with Indigenous communities and in conversation with Indigenous scholarship, this call from scholars, including Epoch, amongst others, to not approach decolonization as a metaphor has been really important for me to stay with. And what Epoch and others are cautioning here is against the sort of sometimes rhetorical use of the trope of decolonization, particularly in the context of education and curricula. That's in many ways can obscure the fact that many of those conversations about making curricula more inclusive or diverse neglects or conveniently ignores the fact that educational institutions are established on lands that continue to be occupied and for whose peoples sovereignty and self-determination continues to be denied. So an example of that, of course, would be Australia, West Papua, North America, and Canada, right? So the call here really is to really engage with questions of the land back movement, right? And to think about structural transformations alongside institutional transformations, rather than the one as separate from the other. And yes, this question of engagement with Indigenous scholarship, I mean, of course, to what extent it will be relevant, to the kind of project one does, depends largely on the project one does. But I think there's been some really, interesting moves in recent years by primarily early career researchers to develop alternative canons, syllabuses, and reading lists that are progressive in the sense that are trying to approach age-old topics like the environment, like kinship, like ethics, like affect, in conversation with bodies of non-Western scholarship that are out there, that do exist, but that don't tend to be prominently cited or foregrounded, and that therefore don't tend to be the key scholars with whom one is in conversation with, right? So looking, I think, for those spaces where progressive coalitional kind of thinking is happening to reimagine what the canon is or what the canon should be and who gets to be part of those decisions and conversations, it's a really good place to start, I suppose, expanding our horizons beyond the center, and to rethink, I suppose, the periphery of knowledge, and to realize that that knowledge is out there. It just doesn't tend to be the one that we immediately accede, and not the ones that students also necessarily immediately come into conversation with.
Yeah, I completely agree. So there's talk of like, obviously, you know, the idea of that, well, that we need to imagine a different world and different ways of living. I'm just thinking, well, actually, these different ways of living are actually out there, it's just that we haven't really paid attention to them. And so I think that feeds into the question that I'm having for you, which you talk about, you know, there's no, the issue is not the failure of imagination, but rather the exclusion that is going on within imagination. And I just wonder whether you could talk a bit more about what can be done really to sort of share Indigenous ways of connecting, living with the land to the wider group of people, or, you know, even outside academia. So obviously you talked about, you know, the Maroon communities, ways of, you know, start walking and start listening, and kind of that way of attuning to their surroundings. So I wonder how we could sort of broadcast this a bit more in order to engage more with sort of caring for the non-human kinship.
Thank you for that question. Yeah, I think I'm going to go back to the words of my Papuan friends, particularly their invitation to learn how to listen, right? I'm an anthropologist. You know, when I started my fieldwork, I was asking a lot of questions of the peoples whose worlds I was trying to understand. And, you know, it was very frustrating for them because they wanted me to listen to the forest, because the forest was going to be my mentor, my instructor, if only I would stop talking and pay attention, right? So I think that's a practice that is in no way, you know, does not have to be restricted to communities who live by an ethos of multisensory attunement and engagement with the more than human world. It's something we can start practicing in our own everyday lives. And listening is one particular way we can use our senses. We can also use our sight, and we can smell, and we can touch, we can taste. And through that, you know, micro phenomenology of the everyday, in the mundane, we can begin to trace partial connections, right? The ways in which matter, in fact, connects us from centers across peripheries in sometimes really unexpected and often violent ways. So I've been thinking a lot with palm oil. A lot of my research has been on oil palm plantations that tend to be established in out-of-the-way, remote plantation frontiers across the tropics, places that might seem far removed from my own, you know, everyday life. And yet palm oil is ubiquitous and omnipresent in the foods we consume, in our toiletries, in our cosmetics, right? It's serpentine and shape-shifting, and it's with us in so many parts of our everyday life. So perhaps, yeah, paying attention to that materiality and the ways in which what's around us connects us to people and other than human people across geographies and across time might be a good place to start putting into practice what Anna Singh's calls that, you know, looking around rather than just ahead, right? And slowing things down and just beginning to tune and reposition ourselves otherwise, I suppose.
Mm-hmm. Yes, but would you say that it might be a difficult for people who live in, like, you know, heavily urbanized and industrialized cities where there's, well, I wouldn't say there's no non-humans, because that's not something that we should say, and definitely that's not true. But there's obviously less compared to like forests and, you know, I don't know, tropical areas or yeah, places like that. So how would one sort of tune to and care for the non-humans in urban areas?
That's a great question. I haven't done a lot of work on urban ecologies, but I know there's a lot out there. I mean, one thing that comes to mind straight away in terms of you know, learning to pay attention to the more than human is to start with our bodies, right? We are more than human. Our gut is millions of other than human beings, right? If this pandemic has taught us anything, the boundary between the human and the non-human is more porous than we think. or imagine or want. So I think, literally starting with the body is also a good place to begin rethinking our own more than humanness. So I think, the urban spaces are also environments where, sure, different kinds of multi-species assemblages are at play, and they might not be quite as evident. They're certainly not the kind of wild, vision that one might have of places like a rainforest, or a desert and so forth. But perhaps that very dichotomy of urban human landscapes versus putatively natural or wild landscapes is in itself kind of part of the problem, right? And William Cronon and others have argued that that conjuring wildness makes us less accountable to places that we don't consider, protection worthy or conservation worthy, right? So a lot of species do make worlds and co-produce ecologies in an urban environment. There are multi-species entrepreneurs and bricoleurs all around us, from our lawns to the birds to species that invade our cities and feed off our waste. Again, I think paying attention to what kind of worlds are made possible, and the extent to which the urban can accommodate other than human life, but also to what extent we are accommodating non-humans for our own aesthetic or instrumental or economic purposes, right? And again, I think that invites us to ask the bigger question of what's at stake and who benefits in these urban ecologies, right? And to what extent are human notions of ethics and aesthetics shaping who counts and who doesn't count in urban scapes.
Yes, yeah, I found it very powerful. Your idea of like starting with the body and then, look around and pay more attention, because that's the way in which we can notice like more life forms that we would be able to if we just sort of like briefly look at it and not really pay close attention. I have another question, but I'll reset to myself and move back to the audience questions. So there's a question from Valentina. She said, "Thank you, Sophie, for such an engaging presentation. I loved your approach, so sensitive to the risk involved with working with epistemologies that may be incommensurable to dominant paradigms in this globalized world. I find your argument about the decolonization of imagination beyond the human through relationality and storytelling compelling and inspiring. Relationality and storytelling are shared across Indigenous groups throughout the world and can manifest in diverse ways within the specificity of their particular tribes. Given the risk involved with knowledge capitalism and cultural appropriation that you mentioned, what advice would you give to researchers interested in working with Indigenous knowledges to amplify Indigenous voices? You mentioned silencing the self to make space for the voices of others. What are some other practical ways in which you do this?"
Great. Thank you so much for your generous words, Valentina. And thank you also for that really important question that you've raised. I just want to preface my response by reiterating that all of this for me is very much an ongoing learning experience, a work in progress of trying to do justice to Indigenous stories and epistemologies, and I hope it will be a lifelong process, one in which I'm making a lot of mistakes and learning also through those mistakes. So in terms of amplifying Indigenous voices, well, I mean, I'm thinking here of early career researchers, because I know there are many presenting at this conference. One thing that, it took me a very long time to get there, but often when we start out in research projects as ECRs, we do a lot of literature review, and we sort of, discover who the key figures are in the canon of whatever theme we happen to be exploring. And, for those of us who are doing field work, one of the risks of reading a lot of high theory is to then basically, try to force the stories and knowledges and experiences of the people in the field into the conventions or categories or paradigms of particular sort of, high theories, right? And that is a form of epistemic violence, right? In some ways, it's using Indigenous experiences and theories to buttress or legitimate or validate, external ways of thinking. So being really cautious of letting the stories that people entrust you with lead the story of your thesis or your article or your chapter, I think is really important. And it's hard to do when you're starting out with research and you're starting out with publications. You feel that there are giants around. Just remember that at the end of the day, your responsibility is to do justice to those stories you've been entrusted in. And it's a privilege, and it's one that demands respect and trust. So let those stories lead your narratives, and sequester some of the theory if it's not directly relevant. The other thing I would say was, to have conversations, like the ones we're having right now about decolonizing research with your interlocutors from the outset, right? Put together your ethics application with them, problematize the politics of pseudonyms, consider together what exactly we mean by consent and coercion. All of these are conversations about ethics that we should be having with the people who tend to be framed as research subjects, right? And to do that as early as possible helps us move towards a sort of more joint production of knowledge kind of model. Another thing that can be really good to do is to diversify the kind of outlets where we're publishing our research, right? Some of it might be academic and theoretical, but one can also put out op-eds, interviews, essays, poetry, films, documentaries, artworks, all kinds of multimodal knowledges, and that are often more in line with the kind of storytelling and oral transmission of knowledge that certainly the people that I've been working with consider to be a primary way of passing on information, knowledge, stories, and so forth, right? So diversifying the modes that are available to us, I think, is also really important. And for those of us who are, invested in our research also in an activist or engaged mode, I don't see those two things as mutually exclusive. Certainly in my case, I came to the PhD research from an activist, a human rights activist background, and engagement and supporting local struggles through participatory mapping or human rights workshops or translating court cases or petitions or complaints, was all part of the research, very much joint, very much built into the research methodology. And it was sort of the minimum I could do in return for the privilege and for the risks that people took in welcoming me into their world, right? So taking activism as, a methodology, I think is also really important, all the while, of course, bearing in mind the risks and the moral hazards that can accompany activism when one is positioned as a foreign scholar, and the potential reprisals that can have for people on the ground. And that's, of course, always the biggest priority.
Yes, that's really helpful, actually, because my research also engages with Indigenous scholars, and your way of talking about how to let them lead the conversation and narratives is very important. And I think that brings me back to your discussion of secular science and also Indigenous and non-Western ways of knowing. How can we get more out of the latter, and how do we balance these very tensional, that's not a word, but these two ways of knowing, and how do we deal with their tension?
Thank you for that question. Well, I think, the first thing I want to say on that is that obviously, Indigenous science and, dominant secular science are not necessarily mutually exclusive ways of, right? The work of Robin Wall Kimmerer, who is a Native American plant scientist at Yale, exemplifies that perfectly. There are ways of just getting a message saying bad network qualities. I'm not sure if that's okay. Close that up. So these are not mutually exclusive frameworks. I think the reason why I was bringing that up is that, well, first of all, I think it's important to talk about Indigenous science, not just TEK or wisdom, as much as that language has done a lot to, give more prominence to Indigenous ways of knowing the natural world. They tend to sort of still fit within a kind of hierarchy of ways of knowing. But I think, the problem with the secular scientific framework, certainly this is a critique that has come from my Papuan interlocutors, is that sometimes, not always, of course, life forms tend to be classified, in a sort of taxonomic sort of framework that can sometimes, come across as rigid and somewhat static, right? Not always so, of course. Evolutionary evolutionary science has much to say. But the sort of labeling or classification of beings as species has potential for rethinking our relations to other beings, but it also has its limits, right? Stories are another way of doing that. Ideas of animacy, vitality, shared skin, that's one idiom that Marind used to talk about life forms, offer alternative ways of thinking about beings, but also becomings and belongings as they operate across different sort of life forms. So I think what we need is not an estuary of dominant scientific secular frameworks, but again, a conversation across different sciences in all their situatedness and in all their specificities, because secular science is also situated and, the product of a particular kind of assemblage or framework that enables particular kinds of knowledges to be produced, right? And sure, there may be incommensurabilities or frictions across these different epistemologies, and perhaps the idea is not so much to resolve them, but to be respectful of those incommensurabilities, and also to think about hierarchies of ways of knowing, right? We're not talking about flat ontologies or flattened epistemologies. These are deeply, the relief of these terrains are profoundly uneven. And it's really those power asymmetries that I think demand a kind of, first of all, distribution of what counts as science and a more inclusive way of, engaging experts who count as experts of the natural world. And they come in many kinds and guises, some human, but not always.
Yes, I completely agree. So yeah, differences are, I guess, what makes the world beautiful, really, kind of the differences and multiplicities and, the ways in which our society is organised or structured. We need multiple forms and ways of knowing in order to accommodate multiple life forms, really. Okay, so we have a question from Margaret. So she said, as a Western researcher, I want to be considerate of the way otherwise, I may do violence using indigenous approaches or histories such as storytelling and radical imagination. Can you share ways you believe the global North Academy can be productive and not commodifying?
Yeah, it's a huge question, Margaret, and I think. I'm thinking with Eve Talk here, that powerful quote of hers, that decolonization is not a metaphor, right? Ultimately, as much of a lot of my scholarship is in inviting decolonial modes of practice and joint production of knowledge, I am ultimately operating within probably one of the most colonial architectures, that is the university. So to what extent is it truly possible to do that within that particular architecture is a related question, I think. But, this idea of, extractive knowledge capitalism, and that powerful phrase from Makere, I think invites ways of rethinking how we use, as you say, indigenous approaches or histories. So one important way of doing that, I think, is to I suppose acknowledge precedents, right? So often, certainly in my space, neologisms and new concepts or theories are often propounded as innovative or different to what has preceded, particularly in the multi-species space, in ways that actually elide or ignore long-standing precedents, not just in philosophy, but also in practice among indigenous and other non-Western societies, right? So being really careful when we think about what's new in our theorizing and whether that is truly the case, or whether it means that there are certain genealogies that are being elided and that enable the construction of a theory or an approach as novel, right? That's one thing I think matters. Another way, I think, is to think about citational politics, right? Who are we citing? And when we're writing about themes or problems or crises that affect us all across all forms of human and non-human difference, right? And I'm not, saying to do this, and I'm not suggesting that we cite in a sort of systematic, make sure everyone's included way. Of course, we want to engage in scholarship that is good to think with, but just being aware of kind of the geographies and the cultures and the identities that are being represented visually in the kind of bibliography that we put together. And there's been some really interesting work there driven by Indigenous scholars, of scholars who are now acknowledging non-human beings as authors, right? And there are articles authored by Bawaka River et al. There are articles authored by Martuwara River of Life et al. The et al is the humans, right? But the river comes first, because the river is the one who is doing a lot of that labor. So it's a radical move, but I think it's a wonderful way of, pushing against the violence of anthropocentrism, right? Anthropocentrism itself being, alien to most Indigenous, ways of knowing and ways of being. Another thing I'd say, perhaps on a much more institutional or practical way, is to, think about collaborative research projects, right? And I'm thinking really here about thinking about grant applications and seeking funding, bringing on board collaborators that kind of better reflect or do justice to the diversity of people's scholars who are invested and affected by these questions. That can be tricky to do, but I think it's a really important move in kind of shifting the sort of institutional hierarchies that are at play. So yeah, those are some thoughts. But again, I think violence is still very much intrinsic to a lot of what's happening, certainly in my space in anthropology. It's why I preface the idea of a decolonial anthropology as potentially an oxymoron, because I'm not quite sure, how much that is possible, or whether we do need a radical rethinking of the way we think about disciplines in the very first instance. So, thanks, Margaret.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think it's a very interesting one. Look at research and what goes into the research, right? Even the non-human entities, they are subjects of these research, not just objects of research. And there's a need to kind of pay attention to the fact that they are the authors as well of those of those research. And there's so much important is obviously collaborative work of research projects as well. So I think the conference also a way of bringing together the kind of collaboration between different fields in research. I just want to touch a bit more on Margaret mentioned of the radical imaginaries, which obviously you talked a lot about in your talk. It reminds me of this idea of radical being something quite dark, the darkness surrounding the way our lives. So can you talk more about how Indigenous people sort of practice this radical care? Maybe do they stop embracing the darkness around them? And I'm thinking about invasive species brought to their lands by settler colonizers. Do they also care for them, or what are their approaches in terms of caring for these sort of non-native species?
Yeah. Thank you so much for that question. Radical. The first thing that comes to mind for me when I think radical is, the stem at the base of a plant that sort of, tentatively grows out like a rhizome and then proliferates. And I like the idea of thinking about radicality in that kind of vegetal mode or rhizomatic mode. In West Papua, where I've been doing fieldwork over the course of the last decade, many Indigenous communities are being dispossessed of their forests and groves and swamplands to make way for industrial monocrop oil palm plantations, and that's having a, it's severing them from their ancestral and intimate ties to native plants and animals and ecosystems, and whom they consider as kin and siblings and grandparents. What kinds of radical care are at play in these disfigured landscapes? Well, I think what a lot of my research has shown is that Marind, on the one hand, they're engaged in all kinds of grassroots activism and land rights reclaiming and advocacy movements, right, directed to corporations, international financial institutions, United Nations bodies, and so forth. So there's that grassroots advocacy and struggle for social and environmental justice happening. But there are also forms of epistemic resistance that I would say also count as a form of radical imagination. And what do I mean by that? Well, much like Marin peoples consider native plants and animals to be sentient and agentive world inhabitants and world makers, so too they describe, conceptualize, perceive the plant that is oil palm, an introduced cash crop, also as an agentive, meaningful, sentient, world-making being, right? So some people express fear and resentment towards this plant because it is devouring their lands and sucking the waters of the rivers dry. It's jeopardizing the lives and futures of both Marin themselves and their more than human kin. But alongside that, many of the people that I lived with, also expressed pity and compassion and empathy towards oil palm, Why? Well, because it too is a victim to all kinds of technological, institutional, capitalist transformations, manipulations, exploitations, extractions, and disfigurations, right? In its transformation from plant to part to product to commodity, right? People would talk about palm oil being, extracted from the bodies of the trees, as palm oil blood. Crude palm oil is red. People would talk about the bunches of fruit being ripped off the tree and then thrown into trucks like dead bodies. People would talk about these plants growing alone in monocrops. They have no friends. There are no other plants or animals. It's just them, right? People would wonder if the oil palm itself felt lonely in this world of only oil palm, right? Now, this is for me is radical imagination in its most potent form, right? It is a refusal to flatten knowledge and non-human beings, including destructive non-human beings like oil palm, to any singular one thing, right? And that is a form of resistance. That is a form of epistemic sovereignty, one that not only counters, the homogeneity of sort of nature-culture divides, but also pushes against the simplifying, reductionist logic of the plantation itself, right? Which is all about disciplining, ordering, extracting, exercising mastery, right? By refusing to reduce oil palm to just a crop, just a plant, just a commodity. Marinda are engaging in that kind of radical care, in that refusal not to care, even when a plant or a commodity is radically disfiguring their own multi-species worlds.
Wow, yes, that's really powerful, and I completely agree. That's very different ways of looking at non-native species, because often just definitely you see them as the resentment because they take away the land and water of the native species, and you don't know what to do with them. And I think that kind of reminds me of the book Arts of Living on Damaged Planet, edited by and I think the ideas of like your jellyfish are both monsters in a ways that they are sort of species going abundant at the moment and causing havoc to human lives. At the same time, they're also victims of humans, by overfishing and killing predators like jellyfish. So I think it's definitely really important ways of understanding sort of these species and through also the concept of monster as well. So we have another question from the audience. So Valentina says, I love an approach to climate crisis that is fueled not by despair, but by radical hope, care and resistance, as you and Dion envision. Can you talk more about this and holistic approaches beyond thinking versus feeling?
Yeah, okay, great. Thank you for that question, Valentina. And I'm glad to hear that you find something hopeful in that framing. I think it's one that that sense of paralysis and despair is one that many of us across all our situated positionalities are experiencing in the face of this hyper object that is the climate crisis, and so many other overlapping crises that seem to be building up to no end. And so I think, thinking beyond thinking versus feeling is actually a great place to start. So often those two tend to be dichotomized, right? And the sort of cognitive, intellectual, sort of mental labor of what it is to produce knowledge versus the sort of affect side of it, and how we feel about how we think and how we think about how we feel, right? And so certainly one thing that Dion taught me and my Papuan friends taught me is that feeling is a source of knowing, right? And that to hold on to the way we feel about things is just as important as the sort of more abstract theoretical abstraction that we often tend to see as kind of the staple of what it is to be an academic. And that's not always easy to do, right? Affect and care are highly feminized realms of scholarly knowledge production. They continue to be very much gendered in that sense. For early career scholars, to feel your way through research, can raise questions about your objectivity, your intellectual sagacity, and that's an unfortunate consequence of that very binary, right, of thinking versus feeling. Instead, I think we need to harness those feelings. We need to reflect on why we feel the things we do in particular situations and particular contexts vis-a-vis particular beings, human and non-human. We need to reflect on where those feelings are sprouting from, to what extent they are shared. We need to think about what they tell us about ourselves as much as what they tell us about the worlds that we are engaging in through our affects. And for me, feeling is, and I love the word because it's as much about, the emotions as it is about literal feeling, right? The sensory side of what it is to inhabit the world, outside of a kind of a disembodied, top-down, God's eye trick sort of perspective, to borrow Haraway's term. So it's dealing with feeling in both of those senses, right? The sensory side of it, the affective side of it, I think is really important. But again, I don't think it's something that institutional and academic knowledge systems and structures necessarily condone, right? Or it's something that often one needs to reach a particular point in one's career to be able to afford to do, right? To disclose the ways in which feelings actually really do shape what we're interested in and why, right? Why we care. But to avow of those things not only allows us to, I suppose, do our work more caringly, it can also put us in a better position to make other people care, right? Or to think about the ways in which our narratives and our outputs can foster a different way of caring about all these different overlapping crises. So I suppose my advice is, hold on to the feelings and stay with them and problematize them, I suppose, because they are an essential counterpart to thinking, and I think we need both.
Yes, I think it's very tied very much to your ideas of multisensory imaginaries, this kind of attunement and kind of feeling what is there, and it's actually evidence of coexistence with, non-human kinfolks, as, Kimura would describe. I know that's a very good place to end the meeting, but I do have a dying question, so I'm just going to ask it, if that's all right. So you talk about Indigenous communities see elements, like river and rocks as animate beings, and I just wonder whether they kind of see there's no death as such, or whether they sort of more blur the lines between the life and non-life and animate, inanimate.
Thank you for that last question. Well, I mean, the first thing I want to say, and I hope it was implicit in most of what I presented, is that, of course, none of what Dion and I write in any ways suggests or assumes that Indigenous peoples have a homogeneous way of, understanding any of these relations, right? We're drawing particularly from the particular peoples we've had the privilege to, think with, or in Dion's case, be from. So that heterogeneity is really important to remember. But yeah, it's a really great question. For Marin, rivers can die, mountains can die. There are funerals being held in Iceland for glaciers that have died, right? They literally have disappeared. They have funerary plates. So some of these ideas are also being taken up elsewhere, right? As extinction and loss are proliferating and multiplying, right? So does that mean there is no such thing as death? No, there is still a notion of death. There's certainly the notion of what counts as a good death and a bad death. Which we don't have time to go into now, but that raises some really interesting questions about not just what it is to have a good life, but also what it might mean to experience a good death. I think what's really central here is that, Marin position life and death within a sense of time or temporality that is not linear, right? Life and death in many Western sort of epistemologies is a linear process, right? For Marin, we're talking about a spiralic conception of death, or a cyclical conception of life and death, where life feeds back into death and in these sort of ongoing cycles of regeneration, right? And beings and energies manifest in different forms across place and across time, but there is also always a sense of a return, right? And that sense of a return is important because it also means that we become ancestors, right? And then we too will be remembered by those who come. And that big question of how we want to be remembered, right? Do we want to be remembered as the bad ancestors, or do we want to be remembered as the good ancestors? And that's a kind of responsibility that operates across generations. And I think, we would do well to think also about how we might be remembered. So yeah, elements can die, and they can be reborn, but they can also, their animacy can continue in different guises. But there are also tipping points, right? A river dies when it is redirected to irrigate an industrial plantation at the expense of diverse communities of riverine life. A mountain can die when its forests have been felled and no species can thrive off vegetation, right? And it becomes bare. So these entities are said to have died, and whether or not they can return, whether or not life can sprout from the ruin and the rubble, is really inchoate and uncertain, right? I love the idea of expanding the idea of death beyond what secular science considers life, right? Beyond species and bios, because it invites a whole array of other actors who also count in the world and whose worlds count.
Yes, I think there's a lot of nuances to the ways in which we perceive death, and in a way, sort of from what you're talking, death could be sort of a bit opportunity for new growth for generations, and that's, I think, very important in this dark world where we need that sort of opportunities and uncertainties in order to do something about it, because the world's not fixed or not closed off, but sort of open-ended. Yes. Okay. Yes. Another place to end, good place to end. The talk today. I would just like to say thank you so much for being here and for sharing lots of fascinating ideas to think with, and also to the audience who have tuned in and sent us your brilliant questions for the discussion as well. So it's going to end the session here. But before we go, I'll just say that we have panel 3 on the themes of resistance, representation, and marginalised communities happening at 11 a.m. British summer time, and I hope that you can join us for that as well. Yes, thank you very much.
Thank you so much. It's wonderful. And thanks for the questions all.